What's going on, guys? Zedd here, bringing you another Soul Calibur 6 video. In today's video, we're going to discuss the importance of a game plan, or at least in my perspective, what the importance of a game plan is. I'll go over some examples of what a game plan looks like, how to adapt it, and then we'll get into adaptation versus reaction, proactive versus reactive, etc. And yeah, we'll just kind of go forward from there. So on screen, I've selected Xianghua and Ivy for a reason. Xianghua I've picked because she's not the only character, but she is a character who has a flexible amount of game plan adaptations she can make while still having viable options. Whereas Ivy, on the flip side, is a little more limited in how she accomplishes her game plan, but how she goes about it still can vary even within the same character's kit. So let's just kind of get right into it. First off, what is a game plan and what is the relevance of a game plan? Well, a game plan simply means your win condition or your goal to win the round, set, game, match, whatever your scale of game plan is in that sense. Sometimes it's a round by round game plan, so if it's later in the set where you're up to 1 and you have 2 bars a meter, maybe it's I'm going to be really aggressive and I'm going to use Soul Charge and I'm just going to try to close out the game with high damage. Or maybe you're down a bunch and you don't have any meters, so you have to play a bit more defensively and reserved. But for the sake of argument, I'm going to try to assume, game 1, round 1, set 1, you haven't played your opponent, you don't have any pre-existing information on your opponent, because that is where having your own fundamental game plan is going to come in handy. So the reason it's important is if you don't have a game plan, then quite essentially you are at the whim of your opponent all the time. So if I boot up in this match against the Ivy and I don't have a particular idea of how I'm going to win going into it, I'm going to spend the entire game blocking and waiting because I don't really have initiative, nor am I taking it, nor am I forcing it. So for me, you have to at least say, or for me, I should say something like, okay, I'm going to try to stay in Ivy's face. Right? You can start simple. I'm going to play aggressive. Okay. Or are you playing character or your preference where you're saying, I'm going to play neutral and I'm just going to try to whiff punish the Ivy the entire time and sort of play out of her throw range, which is about here. That's an option too. And so you want to make that decision based on character, matchup, player preference, etc. It's all entirely up to you. There is no right or wrong answer when discussing game plan. So step 1, are you going to play offensively or defensively? Start very broad right there, and before anything else, make that decision. Step 2 is, okay, how am I going to accomplish that goal? So let's start with offensive options. In a very vague sense, you have what we would call sort of a pressure situation versus mix-ups, and then there's some that sort of thread the line in between. So to give you an example, there's one common tactic that you'll see, which is mids and throws. So throws in Soul Calibur 6 are 18 frames by standard, high mix-up, as in they are front or back break, and there's very little information to say which direction I'm going to throw. And on average, you get about 50 damage per throw. So it's a very powerful tool, and it's very vital. If you land 3 of those, you're well into over half of your opponent's health bar. And then the mids are going to give you a reason to keep them standing. So the more mids you throw out, the less likely your opponent is to duck or crouch your throws because they're worried about the launchers. So this tactic is incredibly effective if your character either has a good throw game, safe launchers, or very damaging launchers. So think maybe Cervantes, right? Not exactly a safe character, but he does have very good mids, and then his throw game is fairly serviceable as well. On the flip side, a character like Xianghua, she of course has multiple safe mids, and her throw game is alright. And the fact that both of her throws sort of lead to a very similar situation mean that it is a bit of a 50-50. There's no ring outs on them or anything like that, so it is what it is. And obviously if your character has command throws, this is more effective, but you don't necessarily need them. So again, just to recap, one option is mid throws. That's sort of a good offensive game plan. And you just sort of enforce that, right? Lots of mids, keep them stand guarding, and then once you've got them guarding, you just keep throwing. Very simple. You see it all the time. The other offensive tactic that's a little more, I guess, involved and a little more matchup slash character specific is the actual low mid mix. So if you're playing a character like, say, Yoshimitsu, as well, even Xianghua herself, Amy, all these characters are examples of characters who can play a very viable low mid mix up. And the reason why this is different than the low throw is the lows are more or less guaranteed damage, in air quotes, guaranteed. Because the throws theoretically can be broken all the time and you're only dealing, I think it's 10 damage on chip every break. But the lows, if you have a fast invisible low that leads to a good situation or a good follow-up in the case of someone like Yoshimitsu's Hell Sweep, right? Then all of a sudden, the opponent may want to start ducking to block that low and punish. Typically, these lows are heavily punishable. For example, at Xianghua, you could use full crouch 3A, 24 damage, 0 on hit, really good low, like super good low. But if they block the low, it is launch punishable. So you sort of weigh your risk rewards there. This style is a little less explosive and more poke based, so a lot of 2K, right? A lot of 5BB, 5AA, 2A, 2B, buttons like that. A bit more of a, shall we say, concise playstyle. Whereas the mids and throws, while being concise, it's a little slower paced, and that's the other advantage to being more poke based or low mid based is traditionally your attacks will be faster than the person using mids and throws because launchers are obviously, you know, I-16 or slower, typically 18 to 20. So there's more room for you to get stuffed out with other faster moves. So again, you have mid throws, that sort of, or mids and throws, that's sort of a very vague first offensive game plan. And then number two would be something like pokes and lows, be very annoying, very hit and run, right? So those are just examples, and they're very vague. Because then you could look at things like, oh, is your character good at guard damage? Is your character good at spacing? Is your character, you know, do they have heavy pushback on their attacks? Things like this all matter. So let's transition into the defensive side of things. If you go, okay, I'm a character who, or a player who likes to play defensive, what do you do? Well, those kind of players or characters will look for things like whiff punishment. So what that means is you're going to try to move in such a way, or play footsies as you could call it, that makes the opponent make mistakes in the neutral game, miss attacks entirely, and then you launch punish or punish accordingly to try to make them feel like every single button they do is a mistake. And so the goal is to make the opponent make mistakes by missing you entirely and then punishing accordingly. That's basically what you do when you're playing that style. It's simple on paper, but the reality is it's very difficult because it relies on the opponent to make mistakes, but if the opponent isn't making mistakes, then it doesn't really work. Another option for defense is to play very heavy on the, for lack of a better word, jab trading or turn trading. So I'm throwing this under defense because it is offensive in nature, but you have to have good defense to do it. So what I mean by that is you're someone who is going to play, again, sort of in and out, very close range neutral, very close range spacing. And you're going to use moves, and you're basically going to play the frames. So you're going to play what I'll call perfect caliber. You're not going to take any risks. You're not going to make any mistakes. You're not going to do anything that's dumb. You're not going to do anything that could potentially get you blown up. And so this kind of playstyle is a lot of single B, 2K, right? A fast low that isn't 2K. So for Xianghua 3A, you know, fast highs. Very safe. It's all safe. Safe. Like no risks at all. And you're just sort of whittling down the opponent, but you're playing the frames. So what I mean by that is if the opponent does something that's plus frames, you don't do anything about it. You just hold that, right? The goal here is you're making no mistakes at all. You are just trying to play the cleanest possible Soul Calibur. Every punish, you take it. Every whiff punish, you take it. But the difference between this and the first defensive style is the first defensive style typically plays further away, trying to bait whiffs, you're not really playing up close at all. Whereas the style I'm describing is to being a little more proactive in their defense by throwing out moves where appropriate and waiting until the time. So they're very patient. It's a very, very patient style, and it's very annoying. It's very difficult, but it does rely on great defense and understanding of the game. With that said, those are just two examples of offensive and defensive. And if you're a character like Shanghua, Cervantes, Sophitia, Tira, the list goes on. Hilda, these are all characters that can flex through all of these different styles. But then you have people like Ivy, right? Characters like Ivy have the problem of having relatively limited kit designs. So Sungmina, Siegfried, Nightmare, Ivy, characters like this can have a really hard time getting the offense going. So they prefer the more whiff punish styles or the throwing moves out and just trying to hit you from a distance. They're more about that life, the keep out or the zoning. And that's not something a character like Shenghua could really do, or Sophie, or, the list goes on, and this is why character play styles are really unique, and this is why people play who they play. Now, if you're playing a character like Ivy, you might think, well, the game plan is quite simple. I want to keep people away with buttons like this, right? B6, the low mid mix there, right? 6-6A hold. You've seen all this before. 3A, right? A6, all these big buttons. 1A, the list goes on. But she doesn't have to play that way. The problem is she's sort of designed to play that way, because as soon as Ivy starts, if the Ivy decides I'm going to play in Shanghua's face, all of a sudden her tools, these range tools, are just gone. And so the unique style and the unique power of this character is just gone. And so now, as the Ivy player, you're relying on very punishable attacks, many slow attacks. You never get to take your turn more than one move at a time, and quite frankly, you just don't have very good block punishment. For Ivy, it's basically AA, everything, and that's it. Like that's it. Or while Rising K everything. There is no real middleman all the way up until 16 or 18 frames. So she doesn't really play this sort of block punishment, sort of in-your-face bob and weave style, right? She doesn't play the hit and run. She more just wants to run and then throw out attacks that you hopefully run into. And she also wants to be very careful that she herself doesn't whiff attacks, otherwise she could have a really hard time. So even though you're playing a character with a somewhat limited game plan, the way you do it changes. And I want to mention this because it's important to understand that once you have developed your playstyle, your game plan, your goal, you don't have to just outright change it for a matchup or a player. You can adapt it, and that sort of leads me to the next point of adaptation. If you're doing the offensive, if you're an offensive player, you like to play sort of at this range, no further than this, and you realize that your opponent's just blocking all the mids and they're breaking all the throws, and they've kind of got your number, you really do want to try to maybe ditch the throws, throw out more lows, and maybe play a little safer. Don't play so slow. Slow meaning mids and throws versus lows and highs, which are a lot faster. It's just one of those things that you have to watch. It's important to understand like what's working, keep doing it. What's not working, don't do it. Because so many players I see who are trying to take that leap from sort of intermediate to advanced, or even from, just online player to tournament player, they have this idea that their opponent is always adapting. And let me tell you something right now. That is not true. Adaptation is very difficult. It's a skill that not every player has, and you may only have it in some matchups against some players. I see so many people they do stuff that's working, and they're like, oh, well, there's no way that's going to work again, so they never do it, right? Like, if I do full crouch 3AB and I hit my opponent, so many Shanghua players are just never going to do it again, because they're like, oh, I got lucky. Well, no, it's important to understand like what works and what doesn't work and just run with it. So many people are so afraid of their style not working, and the problem is that leads to a lack of confidence in your gameplay, and your style. And once you have that lack of confidence, your opponent basically didn't have to do anything, and they've already won the game. Because if I'm doing all this stuff and it's working, and I win the game, and I go into game 2 thinking, oh, well, none of that's going to work, let me change it up. Maybe my opponent hasn't adapted for, like, at all. And so now I'm about to play a new style that their style counters because I'm second guessing my original game plan. Do you see what I mean? How it's important to stick to your guns is maybe a good way to put it. Until you identify it stops working, or if you can make an educated guess or an educated read on the opponent's adaptation and adapt faster than they do. It was a lot of words to basically say, don't change it if it ain't broke, don't fix it. You know? And that is totally true for game plans. With that said, it's important to have 2 different game plans. Now, I don't mean play style. Everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses, and that's just not going to change, frankly. But it is important to know, at least have a fallback idea or an alternative option if your default isn't working, because then you can kind of swap gears, shift gears, depending on the matchup, the player, how the game is going, how the round is going. So if again, you're an offensive player and you just default to sort of mids and throws, and that's just what you do, try to get better at sort of maybe the hit and run or maybe the whiff punish. Like, try to pick an alternate option that works for you, and then just see how that goes. And basically, other than that, just not having a game plan just means the opponent is entirely in control. If my opponent has a game plan and I don't, I've already lost, because this is a fighting game. Even if you're a passive defensive player, you still have to be proactive in your defense. You still have to be proactive in your punishment, in your whiff punishment, or forcing those spacing situations and whiffs. You cannot just sit here and block and be like, I'm gonna win. No. You have to have a goal. You have to have a win condition. If you don't, your mental will just crumble and your opponent doesn't even have to try. They've already won. So that hopefully gets the idea across of why a game plan is so important. Now, to sort of end the video off, how do you devise a game plan? Or how do you figure out which game plan is right for you? Well, it's important to look at a few things. First is what character you play. Because if you're playing a character that's got good frame data, short range, maybe subpar movement, say if you're playing Cassandra, good example, Cassandra's not really looking to whiff punish because her backwards movement is not that great, her range is very short, and she's a relatively linear character, and her block punishment's good. She's very fast, and so she's better at applying pressure and doing that style we call jab trading, playing very clean caliber. But she doesn't really excel at the whiff punishment one, right? So that's the defensive options. She's going to play really, really excellent perfect caliber and clean, but not so good on the whiff punish and spacing. On the flip side, every offensive style for Cassandra is fantastic. She has command throws in both directions, crouch throws, plus frames out the wazoo. She's super safe, lots of mids, lots of buttons to chase you with, as in it's hard to create space against Cassandra. And so a character like that is more suited to someone who is offensive in nature, or more aggressive, if you will. So we're going to stick with that example. So you pick Cassandra, okay, good. Then you want to find what moves do I like to use, and this is actually important too. Because if you're the kind of person who's using a lot of these slower middle attacks, you don't really use a lot of lows, but maybe you like to throw, boom, you already have it, mids and throws, and just sort of stick with that as your primary form of offense and sort of work backwards off of that. Or if you're the kind of Cassandra who's very much like, she's super fast, right, and lots of plus frames, you're just like going, buttons, buttons, buttons. You can develop a game plan around strategic frame control, generating plus frames, abusing plus frames, stuffing your opponent's responses. That is a very valid game plan. The running joke is Cassandra players are always Gorilla or always Unga, but that's because that's what she's very capable of doing, and it's very effective. if you do it right. But there's a difference between mashing and controlling with aggression. Mashing, there is no understanding of the frames. There is no understanding of the situation. You're just doing things on the screen to do things. But a good aggressive Cassandra player is going to make you feel like all of your defensive options are crap. They can never run away from you, or you can never run away from them. And that is a very valid game plan. So say you found that, then maybe your secondary game plan could be that sort of perfect caliber. So you're still playing in this up close range, but instead of just mashing plus frames constantly, you slow it down. You're more controlled. You're looking for those mistakes. You're just punishing everything you can. So you're still playing aggressively, but you're playing slower. And I see so many players just skip this altogether. They'll have the one style, and if it doesn't work, they're just like, oh, forget it. And then they start doing random stuff that isn't good, and they lose. So yeah, there's really no easy way to put it. I cannot tell you a game plan. I can't be like, okay, here's what you do. I can only give suggestions or advice, and so hopefully to some degree this video maybe raises your awareness of your game plan. Maybe you don't even have a game plan, but get one and you will see more success. Always have that light at the end of the tunnel. Like even later in the game, later in the round, you know, if my opponent is at this amount of health and I'm playing Xianghua, right? I know my win condition is one critical edge. So I am looking for one mistake, one move that's minus 12, one situation where I can just go right into CE and, you know, that's all I need to do and I win, right? And so your win condition will shift, or if they're a little, you know, less healthy than that, you're like, okay, now I need a launcher or CE, or if they're at 10%, okay, I can either chip them down or I need one throw and I'll win the game. Right? So it's just about keeping in mind, how do you win? And asking yourself, legitimately asking out loud, how do I win? And you will genuinely get better and see more success. But that's all I've got for you on game plans. I know it's not a very clear-cut concept. It's a little more theoretical than it is anything else, but I hope that's insightful for you, and I will see you on the next one. Have a lovely rest of your day.